Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're kicking off something really special. It's our CSWIP 3.1 exam prep series.
That's right.
Our mission here is pretty simple. Cut through all the noise, give you the really critical knowledge you need, and, well, help you understand the core principles.
Yeah.
It's not just about memorizing answers.
Exactly. We'll be looking at some typical multi-choice questions, the kind you'll see on the Welding Inspector Exam.
Yeah.
But the focus isn't just ticking the right box. We want to explore the why. Why is that the right answer? What's the principle behind it?
Think of it like a guided tour, maybe.
Yeah, a guided tour through the key concepts. We want to help you build a really solid foundation. Knowledge that's useful for the exam, sure, but also way beyond that out in the field.
Making you a more sort of informed and capable inspector.
Precisely.
Okay, let's dive in then. Our first one, it focuses on industrial radiography.
Okay.
So picture this. You're inspecting a weld, 25 millimeter thick steel pipe, pipe-to-pipe weld. You're using the DWSI technique, double wall, single image. And it's according to EN 1435.
Got it. Standard scenario.
Right. So which isotope would you use? Is it a ER 192, B CO 60, C ALR 75, or D YB 169? And the correct answer here, the one you typically reach for, is a ER 192.
Yeah, iridium 192. And it's fascinating why that's the case, isn't it?
It really is.
For that specific thickness, 25 mil steel, ER 192, hits this kind of sweet spot. It's got enough penetrative power to get through the steel properly.
But not too much.
Exactly, not too much. It gives you the image quality, the sensitivity you need to actually find potential defects, like small cracks or porosity.
Yeah.
It balances the resolution you need with, a reasonable exposure time.
So what about the others, like cobalt 60?
Well, cobalt 60 is much more powerful. For 25 mil steel, it's kind of overkill, like
Right.
using a sledgehammer to crack a nut, as you said earlier.
Right.
You might get through, but the energy is so high, you'd likely lose sensitivity. The radiation just punches through without interacting enough to show those finer details clearly. Makes spotting subtle flaws much harder.
Okay, and the other end, YB 169.
Ytterbium 169. Too weak. It just wouldn't have enough energy to penetrate 25 millimeters of steel effectively. You'd end up with a poor image, maybe underexposed, or just not showing you what's inside at all.
So you really need to match the isotope to the job. Material, thickness, it all matters.
Absolutely crucial. It's not one size fits all. Choosing the right source is fundamental to getting a reliable inspection result. It's about accuracy, efficiency, and ultimately safety.
It really highlights how knowing the specifics is key for an inspector. It's the difference between just getting an image and getting a useful image, right?
Precisely. A useful, interpretable image that lets you make a sound judgment.
So moving from inspection tools to the materials themselves, this brings us nicely to our next question. It's about distortion, specifically with stainless steels.
Distortion. Always a fun topic.
Isn't it just, the question, austenitic stainless steels are more susceptible to distortion compared to ferritic steels. Why? Is it A, high coefficient of thermal expansion, low thermal conductivity?
Yeah.
B, high coefficient of thermal expansion, high thermal conductivity? Say, low coefficient of thermal expansion, high thermal expansion, low thermal conductivity.
Let's think about that one. Austenitic stainless.
And the answer is A, high coefficient of thermal expansion, low thermal conductivity.
Correct. And it really drills down into the fundamental properties. Why do those two things together cause so much trouble with distortion?
Yeah, let's unpack that.
Okay, so austenitic stainless steels, they have this really high coefficient of thermal expansion. What that actually means is they expand a lot when heated and contract a lot when cooled. Much more than ferritic steels for the same temperature change.
Like stretching elastic versus a stiff wire. You mentioned that analogy.
Exactly. Big response to temperature changes. Now add to that, they have low thermal conductivity.
Meaning the heat doesn't spread out easily?
Precisely. Heat tends to stay concentrated right where you put it, near the weld. It doesn't dissipate quickly through the rest of the material. So you get these really steep temperature differences, very hot, next to relatively cool metal.
Okay, I see where this is going.
Right. So you've got this material that wants to expand and contract a lot, and you've got intense localized heat creating big temperature gradients.
That sounds like a recipe for stress.
A perfect recipe. This combination generates massive internal stresses as different parts of the metal try to expand or shrink at different rates. And those stresses, they relieve themselves by warping the material. That's your distortion. It's a real Double whammy.
Double whammy. I like that. So knowing this, if you're an inspector looking at a weld procedure for austenitic stainless, what are the immediate red flags? What jumps out?
Good question. The very first thing I'd look for is how they're planning to manage that heat and the resulting movement. Is there a specific welding sequence planned? Like, are they using balanced welding or maybe backstepping?
We'll come on to balanced welding in a sec.
Right. And also things like interpass temperature control. Are they letting it cool sufficiently between passes? Maybe even using forced cooling. And crucially, what's the proposed heat input? Keeping heat input low is often key.
So it's all about controlling that thermal cycle.
Exactly. You need to see a plan to either minimize those stresses or distribute them more evenly. Because trying to fix distortion after it's happened is, well, difficult and expensive. Sometimes impossible without compromising the part.
Proactive is definitely better than reactive here.
Always.
Okay, you mentioned balanced welding. Let's tackle that directly. Our third question. Balanced welding techniques are used for what? A, controlling lamellar tearing. B, increasing weld toughness. C, reducing weld zone hardness. Or D, reducing distortion.
Well, based on what we just discussed.
It leads nicely, doesn't it? The answer is D. They're used to reduce distortion.
Absolutely. Balanced welding is a primary strategy specifically designed to combat distortion. It's all about managing those thermal stresses we just talked about.
So how does it work in practice? What does balanced actually mean here?
It means adopting a strategic approach. It could involve the welding sequence, like alternating welds from one side of a joint to the other, or maybe skip welding, doing short welds spaced out along the joint first, then filling in the gaps.
To spread the heat out more evenly.
Yes, and to balance the shrinkage forces. Sometimes it involves backstep welding, where you weld in the direction opposite to the overall progression. That can introduce compressive stresses that counteract the tensile shrinkage stresses. It can be. It also often involves careful control of heat input, obviously. And in some cases, especially on large structures, you might even have two welders working simultaneously on opposite sides, literally balancing the heat input and stresses in real time.
Wow.
The whole point is to prevent that uneven heating and cooling, that localized shrinkage, which leads to warping. You want to keep the component dimensionally stable.
So for you, the inspector out there, understanding this means you can look at a complex welding sequence and see the purpose behind it. It's not just random steps.
Exactly. It's about ensuring the final product meets its dimensional requirements, which is just as critical as its strength sometimes. It avoids costly rework or rejection. Seeing balanced welding specified should tell you distortion is a key concern they're actively managing.
Got it. Planning and execution to maintain shape. Okay, let's shift gears to a defect type. A nasty one. Hydrogen-induced cold cracking.
Yes, HICC. Or delayed cracking.
Delayed cracking, exactly. So the question is, what four criteria are necessary for it to happen? Is it A, hydrogen, moisture, martensitic grain structure, and heat? B, hydrogen, poor weld profiles, temps above 200 C, and slow cooling. Hydrogen, a susceptible grain structure, stress, and a temperature below 300 degrees C or D. Hydrogen, existing defects, stress, and a susceptible structure.
Right. Need all the ingredients for this one.
And the correct combination, the one you need to remember, is C. Hydrogen, a grain structure susceptible to cracking, stress, and a temperature below 300 degrees C.
That's the classic recipe. All four have to be present at the same time for this type of cracking to occur. It's like a perfect storm.
Let's break those down quickly. Hydrogen first. Where did that come from?
It can sneak in from lots of places. Moisture is the big one. Damp electrodes, wet flux, condensation on the base metal, even just high humidity in the air. Contaminants like grease or paint can also be sources. And you don't need much, sometimes just a few parts per million.
Okay. Then the susceptible grain structure.
That usually means a hard, brittle microstructure. Martensite is the classic example. This tends to form in certain steels, especially higher strength ones, if they cool down too quickly after welding.
So fast cooling can be bad here.
It can contribute significantly by creating that brittle structure. Third is stress.
From the welding itself.
Yeah, residual stresses are always present after welding due to that localized heating and cooling, or it could be external loads applied to the joint. Hydrogen tends to migrate to these high stress areas.
And finally, the temperature. Below 300 C.
Yes, typically below 300, often even down near room temperature. That's why it's called cold cracking. And crucially, it's often delayed. It might happen hours or even days after the welding is finished.
Which makes it really sneaky.
Very insidious. The hydrogen needs time to diffuse through the steel and collect at those stress points in the susceptible microstructure. If you can remove any one of those four factors, get rid of the hydrogen source, control the cooling to avoid the brittle structure, manage the stress, or keep the temperature up for a while, you can prevent the cracking.
Understanding those four is crucial for prevention then. Low hydrogen consumables, preheat, controlling stress.
Absolutely. It gives you the power to stop it before it starts. Which factor do you think gets overlooked most often in practice?
That's a tough one. Maybe the hydrogen. People focus on the welding parameters but forget about basic cleanliness or consumable care.
I think you're right. Hydrogen control is often underestimated. People might think their consumables are dry, or they might not realize how much impact surface contamination or humidity can have. And because it's delayed, they might finish the weld, it looks fine, and they move on, unaware a crack is developing hours later.
A really important reminder about diligence. Okay, final question for today. This one's on mechanical testing.
All right. Testing the results.
Yep, mechanical tests. Which statement is correct? A, tensile tests give a quantitative measurement of weld zone ductility. B, bend tests give a quantitative measurement of weld zone ductility. C, CVN tests give a qualitative measurement of weld zone ductility. Or D, all of the above could give a quantitative measurement of ductility.
Quantitative versus qualitative, an important distinction.
It is. And the correct answer here is A. Tensile tests are used to provide a quantitative measurement of weld zone ductility.
That's spot on. Tensile tests are designed to give you hard numbers, quantitative data.
How so? What do they measure?
When you pull a tensile specimen apart, you measure things like its yield strength, its ultimate tensile strength, and importantly for ductility, you measure the percentage elongation, how much it stretched before it broke, and the percentage reduction in area, how much the cross-section necked down.
So actual numbers you can compare to a standard.
Exactly. Numerical, objective values, that's quantitative. Now, bend tests are very useful.
But they're more visual.
Right. They show you if the material can bend around a certain radius without cracking. It's essentially a pass-fail visual assessment. It demonstrates ductility, but it doesn't give you a specific value for it. It's more qualitative in that sense.
And Charpy tests, CVN. Option 6 mentioned those.
Charpy V-notch tests measure toughness, specifically notch toughness. That's the material's ability to absorb energy and resist fracture when a notch or flaw is present, especially under impact loading or at low temperatures.
Related to ductility, but not the same thing.
Correct. Toughness and ductility are related, but distinct properties. Charpy gives you an energy value, joules, which measures toughness, not a direct quantitative measure of ductility like elongation.
So, tensile for the numbers on stretchiness, bend for the visual proof it can deform, Charpy for toughness.
That's a good summary. You pick the test based on the specific property information you need.
If you need that hard number for ductility for design calculations, perhaps, tensile is the way to go.
Precisely. If an engineer needs to know exactly how much the weld can stretch before failure, maybe for seismic reasons or complex loading scenarios, the tensile test provides that crucial quantitative data.
Fantastic. Okay, well, we've definitely covered some ground today.
We have indeed. From isotopes to material science, distortion control, cracking mechanisms, and testing.
We really hope this deep dive into these questions has helped clarify not just the answers, but the reasoning and the science behind them for your CSWIP 3.1 prep.
Absolutely. And notice how interconnected it all is, you know?
Yeah. How so?
Well, think about it. Choosing the wrong radiography technique might mean you miss a small crack. That crack could be exacerbated by residual stresses from distortion, which occurred because the material properties weren't properly accounted for in the welding procedure. And maybe that crack initiated because the conditions for hydrogen cracking weren't controlled.
It all links together. One small oversight can cascade.
Exactly. It really emphasizes why a holistic understanding is so important. Continuous learning, critical thinking, those are your best tools out there. It's about understanding the whole picture, not just isolated facts.
That's a great way to put it. So keep exploring these connections, review your notes, and definitely stay curious. Think about it. What other subtle links exist between, say, heat treatment and NDT results, or between joint design and susceptibility to specific defects? How can seeing those connections make you a better inspector?
Food for thought.
Definitely. We'll be back soon with more in our CSWIP 3.1 exam prep series. Until then, keep digging deeper and keep up the great work.